Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. They told me at brunch that Christmas would be better without me. I smiled and nodded, but inside I shattered. For 5 years, I had carried their lives in silence. I paid the mortgage on the Maplewood Colonial, the tuition at St. Andrews, even the catered parties where my cookies were pushed aside for trays I had funded. They never knew it was me. That night I made a choice. If they wanted Christmas without a mother, they would have to face Christmas without a home. My name is Maggie, and this is the story of how silence turned into strength. The Garden Bistro in Princeton was alive with the familiar Sunday hum silverware clinking against porcelain voices, rising and falling, like the tide, the faint smell of butter and coffee drifting through the air. I sat across from my son Daniel and his wife Samantha. My hands folded carefully in my lap, trying to quiet the knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter since Sam suggested this brunch. She leaned back in her chair, blonde hair styled in perfect waves, her manicure catching the light as she raised a mimosa to her lips. Her smile was polished, but her eyes were flat. With the same casual tone one might use to mention the weather, she said, "We have decided not to invite you for Christmas this year." The words landed on me like ice water. For a moment I thought I had misheard, but the world around me continued without pause. A man at the next table laughed loudly. The waiter carried a tray of croissants past us. The music overhead played softly. Daniel stared at his plate, the steam from his eggs. Benedict rising and curling in the air, the hollandaise already beginning to stiffen. He would not look at me. He pressed his fork against the yolk until it broke and ran across the plate as if that required all of his attention. My fingers curled around my water glass, condensation wet against my skin. I forced a smile that did not reach my eyes and simply nodded. I had learned long ago that silence could hide storms. Inside, I was unraveling each thread pulled tighter by the sound of her voice. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice low, almost apologetic. "It is just that we want something more intimate this year, Mom." His gaze stayed fixed on his plate, shoulders hunched. The word intimate scraped across me like sandpaper. I thought of the Maplewood house, the colonial they had insisted was perfect for entertaining, the soaring ceilings and wide hallways that seemed designed to be filled with guests. I remembered the holiday parties with catered buffets, the crowds of neighbors and Sam's endless stream of real estate friends, the mountain of gifts stacked beneath a tree taller than I was. None of it intimate, none of it possible without me. Sam set her glass down, the crystal ringing against the table. "My college friends are bringing their families," she added lightly. "The house will be full. Maybe we can do something with you in January, Margaret. Maybe after the holidays." Her voice was bright, practiced, but it carried the edge of dismissal, the tone of someone fitting me into a schedule between obligations. I nodded again, my throat tight. January. Lovely. The server appeared with a smile that did not reach his eyes, refilling water glasses and asking if we wanted dessert. I shook my head quickly. Daniel waved him away as if eager to escape the wait at the table. Sam ordered a flourless chocolate cake to go, her voice cheerful, unconcerned. I noticed the young waiter hesitated, his eyes flicking between us, perhaps sensing the tension that lay heavy over our corner. The rest of the meal passed in fragments. I asked about Ella's school play, about Jack's soccer games, about the clients Sam said were thrilled with her staging tips. I complimented her new highlights, admired the delicate bracelet she wore, which she claimed came from a grateful client. I played my role, the agreeable mother, the agreeable grandmother, smiling until my face ached. Daniel's fork scraped against his plate, the sound grating, and he muttered something about the market being difficult, his tone clipped. Sam filled the silence with chatter, her hands moving in animated gestures. I barely heard them. My mind kept circling back to that single sentence, the one that had cut me from their holiday, as if I were a scrap of fabric no longer needed. When the check came, Daniel reached quickly for it, his credit card already in his hand. He set it down with a sharp motion as if to prove something. I thanked him softly, though the gesture felt hollow. His jaw was tight, his eyes still refusing to meet mine. The drive back to my condo was thick with silence. The heater hissed against the cold outside, the streetlights flickered past the window, and neither of us spoke. I held my purse tightly on my lap, staring out at the passing houses, the Christmas lights already strung across porches and bushes, each one glowing like a reminder of where I was not welcome. When we pulled into the driveway of my modest 2-bedroom condo, Daniel left the engine running. He stared at the dashboard as if it held all the answers he could not give. "Thanks for brunch," I said, gathering my purse. As I stepped out into the crisp December air, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A message glowed on the screen. From Sam. "Just a reminder, could you handle the Christmas catering like last year? Still 30 guests. Same company. Thanks." I stood frozen in the driveway, the cold seeping through my gloves, staring at the words. Not an invitation, not an acknowledgement, only an instruction. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling something inside me bend until it threatened to break. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked slowly toward my front door, the sound of Daniel's car pulling away fading behind me. I let myself into the condo and dropped my purse on the small table by the door. The familiar quiet wrapped around me, so different from the noise of the garden bistro, but instead of comforting me, it felt heavy. I pulled off my coat and stood still in the narrow entryway, my phone still in my hand, Sam's message glowing on the screen. 30 guests. Catering. As if nothing had changed, as if I had not just been erased from the very holiday I had carried for them year after year. I set the phone down and moved through the living room, the walls close and plain, a modest space I had chosen 5 years ago when everything shifted. After Robert died in 2018, the house we had shared for 30 years suddenly felt cavernous, every corner echoing with absence. Daniel and Sam had come to me within weeks, their voices soft, their faces full of what they called concern. "Mom, you cannot stay in that big place alone. It is too much to keep up." Sam had smiled, her hand on Daniel's arm. "We have been looking at houses in Maplewood. There is one perfect for the children. Great schools, safe neighborhood." I had heard the request before they spoke it. They needed my house, or rather the money it represented, to move into their dream colonial. I remember the way Sam's eyes lit up when she pulled the listing from her folder, the way Daniel shifted nervously as if embarrassed by what they were asking. You could use the condo by the lake, Sam had suggested. Maintenance-free close to town, and you would not have to worry about a thing. I had agreed because it seemed like the right thing. I sold the home Robert and I had poured our lives into, stripped the walls of photos, folded quilts we had chosen together, packed away memories that clung to me like dust. The profit went to Daniel and Sam for their down payment. I told myself I was giving the children stability, giving Robert's grandchildren what he would have wanted. I bought the condo in Princeton with what was left smaller and quieter but manageable. What I did not tell them was how much more I gave. When Daniel's firm struggled, when Colin's advisory staggered through lean months, I stepped in. I began sending $3,000 each month to cover their mortgage, another $1,000 to keep Ella and Jack in St. Andrew's Academy. I told myself it was temporary. few months a year at most. Months bled into years, and by now it had been 5. 5 years and more than $220,000 drained from the savings Robert and I had planned to live on in retirement. They never asked how I managed. They never wondered why their bills always smoothed out at the last moment. I let them believe Daniel's firm had found its footing, that their lifestyle was the fruit of his labor. Pride is fragile, and I thought I was protecting his. The truth was less noble. I wanted to believe I was still needed. I walked into the bedroom and opened the drawer of the desk that faced the window. Inside was the folder thick with bank statements, transfer receipts, notations in my handwriting. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk, flipping through page after page. The same numbers month after month. Mortgage, tuition, extra checks for car repairs, for groceries, for Sam's catered parties. Each one a quiet sacrifice. The December air seeped through the thin window glass. I rubbed my arms, staring at the numbers until they blurred. My life since Robert's death had been reduced to transactions, to the quiet shuffling of money from one account to another. I told myself it was love, but the truth pressed on me like weight. I closed the folder and looked up at the small Christmas tree I had placed in the corner last week. A tabletop pine hardly 3 feet tall, decorated with old ornaments Robert and I had collected over the years. The lights glowed softly, steady and small. I thought of the tree in Maplewood, towering and grand, dripping with gold and silver ornaments that Sam boasted came from Europe. I thought of the catering trays spread across long tables, the champagne, the music, the crowd. I remembered slipping into the kitchen last year with a tray of cookies I had baked, only to have Sam wave them aside. The caterer has petit fours, she had said lightly, setting my plate near the sink. My cookies went untouched. The memory stung, but worse was the silence. Not once had anyone acknowledged that I paid for it all. Not once had anyone turned to me with gratitude. I lowered myself into Robert's old armchair, the fabric worn under my palms. I closed my eyes and let the ache wash over me. For 5 years I had carried their house, their children's schooling, their glittering holidays. And now, with a single sentence over brunch, I was cast aside. The tree lights flickered, the only movement in the room. My phone buzzed again on the table, another message likely from Sam, another expectation framed as a request. I did not pick it up. Instead, I stared at the small glow of my tree and thought of Maplewood, of the lavish Christmas I had paid for last year, the one where I sat at the far end of the table next to an uncle who barely heard me, while laughter and chatter filled the other end where Sam played hostess. They had celebrated without me even then. The only difference this year was that they had put it into words. I leaned back in the chair, the folder heavy in my lap. Outside, a neighbor's lights blinked red and green against the winter sky. I felt the weight of my own silence pressing down, but beneath it, something else stirred, something small and sharp. It was the realization that I did not have to keep carrying them. The thought settled in, steady and cold. The season was changing, and so was I. Daniel showed up at my door the next morning without warning, his knock sharp and impatient, the kind that made the glass in the frame rattle. I had barely slept, the constant ringing of the phone from the day before still echoing in my head. I opened the door to find him standing there, shoulders tight inside his expensive wool coat, his jaw-set eyes flashing with a mix of anger and something else I couldn't place. He didn't wait for me to invite him in. He brushed past the cold air, following him inside, leaving a trace of snow on the rug. "Mom, what are you doing?" His voice cracked against the quiet of my living room. "The school called again. The bank called." And Sam is in tears because the caterer won't confirm. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I closed the door slowly and turned to face him. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. I know exactly what I am doing. He spun toward me, his hands raised in disbelief. Then why? Why now? Are you punishing us over one holiday, over Sam saying she wanted something more intimate? The words hit like slaps, but I stood still, letting them land and fade. This isn't about one holiday, Daniel. This is about 5 years. 5 years of me paying for everything while you and Samantha paraded around, pretending it was all yours. He blinked as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Paying for everything, I walked to the desk by the window and pulled open the drawer. The folder lay there heavy and waiting. I carried it to the coffee table and set it down between us. With a careful motion, I opened it and spread the pages. Bank transfers, receipts, statements, all lined in neat rows. 5 years of my life laid bare in numbers. Daniel's face shifted from confusion to disbelief as he picked up the first page. $3,000 a month. His eyes flicked up to me wide. For the mortgage every month since you bought that house, I said quietly. He flipped to another page, his hands trembling. Tuition payments, $1,000 each month, for St. Andrews, and here. He pointed at another statement. Car repairs, groceries, yes, all of it. He let the paper fall back into the folder, his face pale. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I wanted you to believe you could provide. I wanted you to think Colin's advisory was stronger than it was. I thought I was helping you save face, helping your children feel secure. Daniel sank onto the couch, his hands pressing against his forehead. His voice was low, shaking. That's more than $200,000. 220, I corrected gently. I have the totals if you want to see. He looked up, his eyes wet. You've been draining your savings for us? I nodded. For 5 years. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for an answer up there. Then his voice hardened, tinged with panic. But why stop now? Why cut us off so suddenly? You know we depend on this. I stepped closer, my own voice rising sharp with years of swallowed silence. That's the point, Daniel. You depend on me for everything. You've built a life you cannot afford and pushed me to the edges of it. I am not your safety net anymore. He flinched, his lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. The door opened before either of us spoke again. Samantha stormed in, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Her cheeks were flushed, her phone clutched in her manicured hand. I could hear the voicemail she had been replaying, the one from the caterer. She pointed at me as if I were a child caught in a lie. What do you think you're doing, Maggie? Canceling the food, jeopardizing the kids' school, making us look like fools in front of everyone. I straightened my spine tall. I think I'm finally stopping. Stopping what she snapped. Stopping your role as our mother, our grandmother. Stopping being your ATM, I said evenly. Her mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, silence hung between us, thick and hot. Daniel shifted, his voice softer now. Mom, please. You don't understand what this will do to us. I turned to him, my hands shaking, but my words calm. You think I don't, Daniel. If I stop, you may lose the house. You may have to put Ella and Jack in public school. You may have to live like everyone else who earns less than they spend. Samantha's face twisted with anger. That house is ours. That life is ours. No, I said, my voice like steel. That house exists because I paid for it. Those holidays happened because I covered them. Without me, there is no house, no catered Christmas, no illusion. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Samantha paced, muttering under her breath. I felt the years of silence settle behind me like armor. I had been quiet long enough. "Do not mistake my kindness for obligation," I said. "I will not pay for your choices anymore. If you wanted Christmas without me, you will have it. But you will also have a life without my money, without my protection." Samantha spun to Daniel, her voice shrill. "Say something. Tell her she cannot do this." He looked up at me, his expression caught between fear and shame. "Mom, please. We cannot manage without your help." I met his gaze steady. "You managed to exclude me without a second thought. You will manage this too." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel's eyes darted to the folder still open on the table, the neat rows of numbers that told the story he had never asked to hear. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. For the first time, I saw him not as my son, but as a man who had allowed himself to be carried long past the point he should have walked. Samantha broke the stillness with a bitter laugh, her voice edged with contempt. "You think you're teaching us a lesson? You're destroying your own family?" "No," I said quietly. "I am saving what is left of myself." Her face flushed, her eyes flashing, but Daniel didn't defend her. He sat there silent, the weight of the truth pressing down. I gathered the folder and slid it back into the drawer, closing it with finality. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Neither of them moved. Samantha stood rigid, her arms crossed, her anger spilling into the air. Daniel sat, hunched, his hands slack on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. I walked to the window and looked out at the street below, the bare branches swaying in the wind. My breath fogged the glass. I felt both weak and strong, broken and whole. Behind me, Samantha's voice cracked in a last desperate plea. "You cannot mean this." I turned, my voice steady, colder than it had ever been. "I do." The room fell silent again. Daniel's shoulders trembled. His head bowed, his fear finally visible. I stood there, the quiet wrapping around us, knowing the shift had already begun, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. The knock on my door was not tentative. It came hard and fast, the kind of pounding that carried anger in every thud. I set the album aside and rose slowly, bracing myself before opening the door. Daniel stood there, his face flushed from the cold and from fury. His coat hung open, his tie loosened, and his eyes burned into mine with a mixture of panic and accusation. "Mom, are you punishing us?" His voice cracked through the quiet hall. "Just because Sam said she wanted something different for Christmas?" I stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. He stormed past me, the scent of snow clinging to him, his shoes leaving wet marks across my rug. Closing the door behind us, I steadied my voice. "This isn't about Christmas, Daniel. It hasn't been about Christmas for a long time." He spun around incredulous. "Then what is it about? You canceled the tuition, the mortgage, the catering. Do you have any idea what this is doing to us?" I walked to the desk by the window and pulled open the drawer, my hands calm though my heart pounded. "For 5 years I said you and Sam have treated me like an ATM. That stops today." Daniel blinked, his mouth open as if he hadn't heard me right. Like an ATM, I pulled the folder out and set it on the coffee table between us. With a careful hand, I flipped it open, page after page of statements and receipts exposed. "Look for yourself." He stepped closer, hesitant, and picked up the first page. His brow furrowed, then his eyes widened. "Mortgage transfers. Every month. $3,000. He glanced up at me, his voice low. "Since the beginning. Since the day you signed those papers," I said. He dropped the sheet back into the folder, grabbed another. "Tuition payments. $1,000 every month. For Ella and Jack." His voice shook. "And here groceries, car repairs, Even catering. Yes, every holiday meal you've served, every party Sam has hosted, I covered. He stared at the pile, his face pale. That's over $200,000. 220, I corrected softly. I kept count. Daniel staggered back a step, pressing a hand to his forehead. Why didn't you say anything? Because I thought I was helping you. Because I wanted you to believe your firm was stronger than it was. I wanted to protect your pride. His eyes filled with something I couldn't name, shame perhaps, or fear. He sank onto the couch, the folder still open in front of him. You can't just stop, Mom. We need this. The house, the school, everything depends on it. That is the point, Daniel. You've built a life you can't afford, and you've done it on my back. The front door opened suddenly, and Samantha swept in her heels sharp against the floor. She had Ella and Jack behind her, both children, wide-eyed coats still half-zipped. Sam's face was hard, her phone clutched in one hand. What's going on here? The school called me. The caterer called. The bank called. She glared at me, her voice rising. You're ruining everything. Ella and Jack hovered near the doorway, uncertain, watching the storm. I glanced at them, my chest aching. Sam stepped closer, her words slicing the air. After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us. All you've done for me. I asked, my voice steady. Samantha, I have paid for your home, your children's education, your holidays. Without me, none of it exists. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut, fury flashing in her eyes. Daniel looked between us, torn, his hands twisting together. Mom, please don't do this. We'll lose everything. I stood taller, my hands trembling, but my voice cold as steel. Do not think that house will stand without me. For a moment the room froze. Samantha's face turned crimson, her voice breaking into a shout. How dare you? How dare you threaten us like this? Ella flinched at the volume, grabbing Jack's hand. Daniel pressed his lips together, his shoulders sagging, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not denial, fear. I looked at my grandchildren, their young faces filled with confusion, and felt the truth settle heavy inside me. They would grow up one way or another, but I would no longer be the silent foundation beneath a house of pretense. The air was thick with Samantha's rage, with Daniel's silence, with the children's unease. I closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and let the sound of it shutting mark the end of my part in their illusion. The house felt unusually quiet the following morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. A dull thump in the mailbox broke the silence. I opened the front door, the chill of December rushing in, and pulled out a thick envelope with the familiar insignia of First National Bank stamped on the corner. My stomach tightened before I even tore it open. Inside was a letter written in stiff legal phrases. Notice of delinquency. Immediate payment required. Failure to respond will result in foreclosure proceedings. The words blurred as I read them twice, maybe 3 times, the cold certainty of it washing through me. I set the letter on the counter, my hand lingering on it longer than I meant to. For years, I had been the one to intercept such storms before they formed, quietly moving money from my account to theirs, making sure no such letter ever landed in their mailbox. Now, with the lifeline severed, the storm had arrived. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into the folder already thick with proof of what I had carried. The phone calls resumed almost immediately. Sam's voice blared through voicemail, sharp and frantic. Maggie, the bank, sent us a letter. Do you have any idea how this looks? People talk Maggie. They already are. Another call from Daniel followed, his tone hoarse with exhaustion. Mom, if we don't fix this, we could lose everything. Clients are nervous. Sam is falling apart. Please." I didn't return either call. I made tea instead, carrying the cup to the window where frost spread delicate patterns across the glass. Outside, children bundled in scarves dragged sleds through patches of snow, their laughter ringing out in the crisp air. A reminder of life moving on indifferent to crisis. By midweek, the whispers had begun to ripple through Maplewood. I heard them first from a neighbor in Princeton who bumped into me at the market. She leaned closer, her voice lowered but eager. "I thought Daniel's firm was doing so well, but I heard they're behind on the mortgage. Is that true?" I forced a small smile, polite but unrevealing. The conversation shifted quickly, but the damage was clear. At St. Andrew's Academy, the whispers were louder. Ella's friend's mother mentioned during drop-off that Sam had seemed distracted, flustered, even defensive at the PTA meeting. Tuition issues, someone said. Trouble at home. Sam had built her reputation on polish and control, on the image of a woman with everything handled. But the cracks were visible now, and Maplewood was a place where cracks spread quickly. I went to the grocery store 2 days later, a short list in hand. As I reached for a loaf of bread, I overheard 2 women by the produce section. "Apparently the Collins family is in trouble," one whispered. "Mortgage past due." The other clucked her tongue, adjusting her coat. And here I thought they were the picture of success. Didn't Daniel have some big investment firm? I stood very still, the loaf of bread pressed to my chest, their words ringing in my ears. They had no idea I was only a few feet away, or perhaps they did and pretended not to notice. Either way, the sting was the same. For 5 years, I had been invisible, a silent partner funding the life they bragged about. Now stripped of my support, the illusion was collapsing, and everyone was eager to witness the fall. Saturday morning brought another call from Daniel. His voice cracked with something deeper than anger this time. "Clients are leaving, Mom. They're pulling accounts saying they can't risk it if my own finances are unstable." He paused, a ragged breath filling the silence. "They're saying things. That Collins Advisory is a house of cards." I listened without replying. The truth was a house of cards. He had built it on my quiet foundation, and now that foundation was gone. Sunday after church, as I stepped outside into the brisk air, an older neighbor from Maplewood intercepted me. She clasped my arm gently, her face full of forced sympathy. "I thought Daniel was thriving. Such a shame." I nodded, offering no explanation. My lips formed the polite smile I had mastered, but inside, I felt something colder, steadier. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the small bakery in town. The line was long, the air sweet with sugar and cinnamon. As I waited, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Mrs. Reynolds, a woman I had seen at Sam's parties, smiled too brightly. "I heard Daniel's firm is struggling." "Mortgage problems," she said, her voice pitched just high enough for the people behind us to hear. "I always thought your son was one of the successful ones." Her words cut sharper than she intended. I lifted my chin and met her gaze. Success built on someone else's sacrifice is not success at all. The brightness dimmed in her eyes, and she turned away quickly, her cheeks flushed. I left the bakery with a small bag of cookies, the cold wind biting against my skin. Behind me, voices rose and fell, carrying new versions of the story. Maplewood loved its gossip, and Sam had given them a feast. Back home, I placed the bag on the table and pulled the folder from the drawer. The bank notice sat on top, its language stark. I pressed my hand flat against it, steadying myself. They had chosen Christmas without me. Soon they would learn what it meant to live without the safety net they had mistaken for entitlement. That evening, as I walked to the trash chute with the day's scraps, another neighbor stopped me in the hall. She tilted her head, curiosity sharp in her eyes. "I thought your son was doing so well," she said softly. "I guess you never really know, do you?" I gave her a small nod, my voice quiet but firm. "You know more than you think." She blinked, startled, and I walked past her, the echo of my own words lingering. For years I had been invisible. Now, without lifting a finger, the truth was being revealed. I returned to my condo, the folder heavy under my arm. The tree in the corner glowed softly, steady lights in the dim room. I sat and let the quiet settle, the phone buzzing again across the table, ignored. Outside, the world carried on, children laughing, neighbors whispering, clients retreating. Inside, I felt the shift harden into certainty. This was only the beginning. I heard from a neighbor in passing that week that the whispers had reached further than Maplewood. They had seeped into conference rooms and client calls, into the ears of people Daniel depended on to keep Colin's advisory alive. By Thursday, the rumors had taken shape. Daniel's firm was unstable. He could not keep up with his own mortgage. How could he manage anyone else's money, Daniel called that evening, his voice ragged. "Mom, I lost the Ridgeway account. They pulled $2 million in assets today." He stopped, breathing uneven. "They said they could not risk it, not with what they've been hearing." I held the phone close, but I said nothing. He filled the silence, his words tumbling out in desperation. "The Halcyon Group is reconsidering too. If they leave, I don't know how we survive." I imagined him in his sleek office, the one with glass walls and modern furniture bought on credit, his employees shifting uneasily in their chairs as phones rang less often, as clients withdrew one by one. The illusion was crumbling, and everyone could see the cracks. By Monday morning, 2 of his junior advisors had resigned. I knew this because Daniel drove to my condo, pacing the length of my living room, his coat still on, his hair disheveled. "They walked out without notice, Mom. Said they needed stability, said they could not risk their careers here." He rubbed his hands together, his voice rising. "Do you understand? I built this firm from nothing. You built it on me," I wanted to say, but kept silent. He wore his pride like armor, even as it rusted. A day later, the call came from Mark Adler, an old colleague of Robert's and a man Daniel had once admired. He met Daniel for coffee at a downtown cafe. I was not there, but Daniel recounted the conversation in clipped sentences over the phone, his humiliation leaking through every word. "Mark offered me a position," he said, "at Hamilton Pierce, a steady salary, benefits, a job." His voice broke on the word. He had always insisted on being the one in control, the founder, the visionary. Now he was being invited to become an employee, a subordinate. He told me he had laughed at first, bitter and sharp, but Mark had not smiled. Think about it, Daniel. Stability matters more than ego. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to my son wrestle with reality. He had spent years believing himself the architect of success, but every brick of that house had been mortared with my money. Without it, the structure collapsed. That night, I pulled the folder from the drawer again, laying the bank's notice on top of the old transfers. My hands traced the neat lines of numbers. Each payment had been a silent reinforcement of Daniel's image, each check a stone in the castle he claimed as his own. Now stripped away, he was left staring at foundations that did not belong to him. I thought of Robert, of the lessons he had tried to instill in Daniel. Work hard. Live within your means. Build slowly. Daniel had nodded, had pretended to listen. But when Robert died, pride and fear had guided him instead. Pride to impress fear of appearing less than others. My money had cushioned the fall until now. A few days later, I overheard two men talking at the diner near my condo, their voices low but carrying. Colin's advisory is a mess. I would not touch it with a 10-foot pole. One laughed, stirring his coffee. I heard his own mother had been footing the bills. The words stung even though they were true. I sipped my tea and kept my head down, pretending not to hear, but the humiliation curled deep in my chest. For Daniel, the damage was worse. His pride had been punctured in public, his credibility dissolving. When he came to me again, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped, he no longer shouted. He sat on the edge of my couch and whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." For the first time, I saw him as a man who understood what he had lost. Not just clients, not just employees, but the illusion of being self-made. I placed my hand on the folder beside me and met his eyes. "Everything you built was on my back, Daniel. Now you have to stand on your own." He lowered his gaze, his hands tightening into fists. For once he did not argue. The silence between us was heavier than any words. It was the silence of truth finally breaking through. The envelope was waiting in my mailbox when I returned from the market, its thick cream paper standing out among the usual bills and circulars. The return address read Miller & Associates, a firm I did not know, embossed in heavy black lettering as if authority could be printed on stationery. I carried it inside, set my groceries on the counter, and slid it open with the small paring knife I used for fruit. Inside was a letter from Gregory Miller, attorney at law, representing Samantha and Daniel Collins. It was written in clipped formal language, but its meaning was blunt enough. Based on your long-standing history of financial contributions, our clients reasonably relied upon your continued support. Your sudden cessation has created hardship and constitutes an obligation to maintain prior levels of assistance. We request immediate resumption of payments to avoid further action. I read it twice, my heart thudding, but not from fear. Fury rose instead, slow and hot, filling my chest until my hands shook. Obligation. Hardship. Words chosen to shame, to corner me. For 5 years I had drained my savings into their lives, and now they had the audacity to cloak their greed in legal threats. I laid the letter flat on the counter, pressed my palms down, and stared out the window at the gray December sky. That night I sat in Robert's old armchair, the letter in my lap, the folder of receipts beside me. I traced the lines of numbers with my finger, mortgage payments, tuition checks, catering invoices, the sum of years of sacrifice. The more I stared, the clearer it became. This was not evidence of obligation. This was evidence of what I had already given far beyond reason. I whispered into the quiet room. They think they can scare me back into submission. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I called Richard Hayes, Robert's friend of decades, a man whose advice had guided us through mortgages and investments, long before Daniel and Sam had ever needed help. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm, steady. "Maggie, it's been too long. What can I do for you?" I told him everything, my words clipped with anger I could not hide. He listened without interrupting, then sighed. "Bring it by. I'll read it myself, but I can already tell you they're bluffing." That afternoon I drove into Trenton, the roads clogged with holiday shoppers, the air carrying faint strains of carols from storefronts. Richard's office was quiet, lined with shelves of books and framed photos of his grandchildren. He welcomed me in, took the letter, and read it carefully, adjusting his glasses. When he finished, he leaned back and shook his head. Exactly what I expected. He tapped the page with one blunt finger. "Maggie, this is smoke. In the United States, no parent has a legal obligation to support an adult child. Not at 42, not at 39. The idea that you can be compelled to continue is laughable. If they ever filed something like this in court, it wouldn't survive a first hearing. Relief broke over me, but indignation remained stronger than before. They thought they could bully me, thought I would cower before the sound of legal jargon. Richard leaned forward, his voice firm. This crumbling. Clawing for control. Don't let them rattle you. I nodded slowly, the decision already taking root. You're right. This ends today. Before I left, Richard gave me one last piece of advice. If you still have any automatic transfers connected to their accounts, shut them down. Don't leave a single crack open. The drive back to Princeton was quiet, the late afternoon light already fading, headlights flickering on along the streets. I parked in front of the condo, carried the letter inside, and set it on the kitchen table. Then I opened my laptop. The bank portal glowed its rows of scheduled transfers like chains waiting to be broken. I worked methodically. The mortgage transfer $3,000 a month canceled with a click and a confirmation. The tuition payment $1,000 canceled. The catering account tied to my card erased. Then the smaller things I had almost forgotten, subscription boxes, utilities, quietly routed to me, Sam's little manipulations over the years. I deleted them all. Each click felt like a blade cutting clean, each confirmation like breath after suffocation. When the last one vanished, the page looked almost bare. My accounts for the first time in half a decade were truly mine. I leaned back in the chair, pressed a hand to my chest, and breathed deeply. The silence in the condo was profound. It was not heavy as before, but liberating, echoing with possibility. I gathered the printed confirmations, signed them in firm strokes, and slid them into the folder along with the lawyer's letter. Evidence of what I had given, evidence of their desperation, evidence of my decision. The small tree in the corner glowed softly, its light steady against the darkening window. I sat in Robert's chair, folded my hands, and let the peace settle. For the first time in years, I felt myself reclaiming something I had given away too freely. No more, I whispered. Not again. The phone buzzed on the counter, a new message, no doubt from Daniel or Sam, another demand wrapped in panic. I ignored it. Instead, I stared at the tree, at its simple ornaments from years past, and thought of the life I still had left to live. A life not bound by their debts or their expectations. When I rose, I felt lighter, as if I had set down a burden I should never have carried. The folder rested closed on the desk, its edges worn, but its contents now transformed. Not chains, but proof. Proof that I had given enough. Proof that I had finally chosen myself. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, I allowed myself to believe that the years ahead could be my own. The foreclosure notice reached their mailbox just as the holiday lights in Maplewood were beginning to glow along the neighborhood streets. I learned of it when Daniel's frantic voice broke through my voicemail, clipped and breathless. "Mom, it's official. The bank is taking the house. We have to be out by Christmas." The words tumbled in panic, but I did not return the call. The path had been laid the moment I pressed cancel on those transfers, and now it was carrying them exactly where it was always bound to lead. That week, the street outside their colonial was lined with cars. Neighbors lingered at the ends of their driveways, bundled in coats, voices hushed but eager as they watched the unraveling. The mover's truck idled in front of Daniel and Sam's house, its exhaust curling into the cold December air. I parked down the block and stepped out, the crunch of snow beneath my boots, sharp in the stillness. The sound of furniture being carried out echoed across the street, thuds and muffled shouts as pieces of their carefully curated life were hauled into the truck. The grand wreath that Sam had boasted about only weeks before hung limp on the door, its bow askew. Through the wide front window, I could see the massive Christmas tree being pulled down, ornaments clattering into boxes, strands of lights tangling. A year ago, I had paid for that tree for the caterer who trimmed it with imported decorations while Sam directed from the staircase. Now stripped bare, it looked like a fallen soldier branches scraping the hardwood as the movers dragged it out. Ella stood on the porch, her small hands stuffed into oversized gloves, tears streaking her cheeks despite the cold. Jack hovered close to her, clutching the hem of her coat. I walked slowly toward them, the weight of their grief pulling me forward. Ella saw me and ran, throwing herself into my arms. Her sobs were hot against my chest, her words broken. "Grandma, why are we losing our house? Why do we have to leave?" I knelt in the snow, holding her tight, my breath clouding the air between us. "Because, sweetheart, your parents have been spending more money than they earned. When you do that for too long, eventually the bills come due. This is a hard lesson, but it is about responsibility." Her wide eyes searched mine, desperate. "But you always helped. Couldn't you help just one more time?" The question pierced me deeper than Sam's letter or Daniel's pleas ever could. I brushed a strand of hair from her damp cheek and answered softly, "I have helped for years, Ella. More than you know. But if I keep fixing everything, your parents will never learn. Sometimes love means stepping back even when it hurts." Sam's voice cut across the yard, sharp enough to make Jack flinch. "Maggie, get away from them." She stomped down the porch steps, her heels sinking into the snow, her face red with rage. "This is your doing. If you hadn't abandoned us, we'd still have our home." Daniel followed her slower, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, his shoulders hunched. He would not look at me directly, his gaze fixed somewhere near the ground. I rose to my feet, keeping Ella's hand in mine. My voice was calm, steady, the words I had carried for weeks finally rising. "You wanted Christmas without me, Samantha. Now you will have Christmas without a home." The silence that followed cut sharper than her shouting. Sam's mouth opened, but no sound came. The neighbors across the street shifted uncomfortably, their whispers turning into stares. Daniel finally lifted his eyes to mine, and in them I saw not anger but shame, raw and unguarded. The movers carried the last of the furniture out, setting boxes onto the snow-dusted driveway. The sound of tape ripping through the air was oddly final. Ella clung to me until Sam called her name, her voice cracking with desperation. "Go inside, both of you." Ella hesitated, looking back at me before guiding Jack into the hollowed house. I watched them disappear, my chest heavy, then turned back to Sam and Daniel. Sam's fury flickered, but beneath it was fear, sharp and undeniable. Daniel stood frozen, his lips pressed tight, as though every illusion he had built was collapsing right there in front of his neighbors. I let go of Ella's glove, still warm in my hand, and walked back toward my car. Each step crunched in the snow, the air thick with the scent of pine and the faint sound of Christmas music drifting from another house down the block. I reached the car door, paused, and looked once more at the Colonial. Its lights still twinkled along the roofline, bright and brittle against the fading day. A house built on my sacrifice, now undone by the truth of its own foundation. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and let the heater fill the cabin with warmth. Through the windshield, I saw Daniel place a hand on the porch, railing, his shoulders sagging. Sam stood rigid beside him, her arms crossed, fury radiating, but powerless. As I pulled away, the image shrank in my rearview mirror. the house, the wreath, the neighbors' whispers all fading into the snowy street. The burden I had carried for years was no longer mine. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt the cold air in my lungs like freedom, crisp and sharp. The chapter of sacrifice had closed, and a new one was waiting just beyond the falling snow. The days after the movers hauled away the last of their belongings were a blur of humiliation for Daniel and Samantha. Maplewood was a small community, and small communities fed on stories. Word traveled quickly that the Collins house had been repossessed, that the family had been forced to leave just before Christmas. Neighbors who had once sipped champagne at their holiday parties now whispered in grocery aisles, shaking their heads. By the time I picked up a newspaper at the corner store, Collins' advisory had already been mentioned in the business section as another casualty of poor management and dwindling trust. Daniel's firm, once dressed up in glossy brochures and sleek offices, had officially closed its doors. The phones went unanswered, the website taken down, the glass door covered with paper to block the view of empty desks. Employees left quietly, carrying their belongings in boxes, their eyes averted. Clients fled faster than Daniel could call them back. The empire he had insisted was built by his brilliance turned out to be nothing but scaffolding held together with my silent support. Without it, the structure collapsed almost overnight. Daniel left me a message the morning after the office shut down. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of the arrogance that had always colored it. "Mom, it's gone. Collins' advisory is finished. I had to let everyone go." His words trailed off into silence before the machine clicked off. I sat at my kitchen table listening to the message twice, feeling no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had always been true. Meanwhile, Samantha's rage spilled into every corner of their small rental. Neighbors later told me they could hear her through the walls shouting long into the night. "How could you let this happen? You've ruined everything, Daniel. You've ruined me. You've ruined the kids." Her voice cut sharp, but underneath it was panic. She had built her identity on the shine of appearances on parties and perfect highlights on being admired. Now all of that was gone, and she was left with nothing but the echo of her own fury. Daniel tried to defend himself, but the fight had gone out of him. He drank more, spoke less, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Each argument ended the same way, with Samantha pacing furiously while he sat staring at the floor. His pride had rotted into shame, his silence saying more than his words ever could. The children bore the weight of it most. Ella, 12 years old, and once so bright and lively, grew quiet. She lowered her head at school, overhearing the whispers of other mothers, the gossip passed down to her classmates. Jack, only 9, grew withdrawn, ashamed to invite friends over to the sparse rental that smelled of cardboard boxes and old paint. He asked questions in the dark ones no child should have to ask. "Why don't we have our house anymore? Why is Dad home all the time? Why does Mom cry in the bathroom?" Samantha snapped at them whenever they asked, telling them to stop, that they wouldn't understand. Daniel tried to soften the blow, but his words carried no weight anymore. The children saw through the lies, and the cracks in the family widened. One night, as I sat in Robert's chair with a cup of tea cooling in my hand, my phone buzzed. I expected another voicemail from Samantha, shrill and blaming, but when I answered, it was Ella's small voice trembling on the line. "Grandma." My breath caught. "Ella, sweetheart, what's wrong?" She sniffled, her words tumbling out in whispers. "I don't want to be here anymore. Mom and Dad fight all the time. Jack cries at night. I can't sleep. Can I come stay with you, please?" The teacup rattled against its saucer as my hand shook. "My sweet girl," I said softly, You are always welcome with me. Always." She sobbed quietly, relief and fear tangled together. "Don't tell Mom I called, she'll be mad." I promised her I wouldn't, then listened as she whispered goodnight before hanging up. The silence that followed was heavier than any quiet before. It was the silence of a child reaching for stability when her parents could no longer provide it. I set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the small Christmas tree glowing in the corner. Its ornaments were simple, collected over years, each one a memory with Robert. They shone steady and warm, a sharp contrast to the towering tree that had once dominated the Maplewood house, now lying in pieces at the curb. I thought of Robert, of what he would have said. He believed in letting consequences teach lessons, but he also believed in protecting the innocent, in drawing the line where children were concerned. The parents had chosen their path, but the children should not have to stumble in the dark with them. The snow began to fall again outside, soft flakes swirling under the streetlights. I pressed my hand against my heart, whispering into the quiet. They may have lost their house, their firm, their reputation, but Ella and Jack will not lose me. The phone buzzed again on the table, a new message waiting. I didn't check it. I didn't need to hear more blame or anger from Samantha or more despair from Daniel. Instead, I closed my eyes and heard only Ella's voice, small and desperate, asking to come to me. That was the only call I would answer. As the night deepened, I sat in the glow of the tree, the silence no longer heavy but purposeful. The collapse of Daniel and Samantha's world was nearly complete. Yet in that collapse, something new was forming, fragile but real. A chance to show Ella and Jack what love looked like when it wasn't measured in money or in pretense. A love that was steady, that did not vanish with foreclosure notices or shuttered offices. And as I sat there, I understood that this Christmas, though stripped of grandeur, might finally carry the truth I had waited years to see. When the realtor's car curved off the main road and followed the quiet lanes of Delaware's coast, I felt as though I were stepping into another life. The stress that had weighed me down for years seemed to loosen with every mile. The air smelled faintly of salt and pine, the sky stretched wide above, and in the distance I could hear the ocean. Sea Pine's coastal community appeared suddenly tucked behind dunes and tall grasses, a collection of cottages painted in pastel shades. It was simple, unassuming, and unlike the grand facades of Maplewood, it whispered of peace rather than prestige. The cottage I had come to see was a small yellow house with white trim and a wide porch. A seashell wreath hung on the door, and the garden out front was modest but neat, the soil turned as if someone had tended it with care. When I stepped inside, light poured through the windows. Hardwood floors shone warmly, the air smelled faintly of sea breeze, and from the back porch I could hear the rhythm of waves. My chest lifted with each sound, each sight. This was not Maplewood's stage of appearances. This was something true. I told the realtor I wanted it before she finished her tour. Weeks later, I packed what little was truly mine and moved in. The yellow cottage became home, not a house full of ghosts or expectations, but a place where I could finally rest. The first morning I baked cookies in the small kitchen, the scent of butter and sugar filling the air. I carried a plate across the lawn to meet Harriet, my neighbor, a retired librarian with sharp eyes and an easy laugh. She accepted the cookies with delight and insisted on lending me a stack of mystery novels the same afternoon. On the other side was Ben, a widower and former police officer who introduced himself with a warm handshake and a jar of honey from his own beehives. For the first time in years, I felt welcomed simply for being Maggie, not for what I could provide. Days settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, I walked the beach, the sand cool and damp under my shoes' gulls, wheeling above as the waves rolled in, steady and endless. In the afternoons, I set up a small table by the window and began painting with watercolors, something I had always told myself I would try one day. The brushes felt clumsy at first, but the colors spilled into shapes that gave me quiet joy. Each evening, I lit the small Christmas tree in my living room, decorated with the ornaments Robert and I had collected, their familiar glow, filling the cottage with memory and comfort. One evening, just as twilight deepened, the phone rang. Daniel's number glowed on the screen. My hand hesitated before I picked up. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Mom, I just wanted to say I'm sorry." He paused, his breath catching. "I should have seen what I was doing to you. I should have stopped Sam." In the background, I heard movement, a door shutting, then Sam's muffled voice, cold and clipped. She wasn't part of this apology, not now. I held the phone, listening to my son wrestle with guilt. His words were fragile, but they were real. I told him I heard him. I told him I hoped he could stand on his own feet at last. It was not forgiveness in full, not yet, but it was a beginning. A few nights later, as I sat with tea on the porch, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was Ella. Her voice was hushed, urgent. "Grandma, I miss you so much." Then she broke into tears, the sound slicing through me. "Mom and Dad fight every night." Jack cries, "Can I come stay with you this weekend, please?" My throat tightened. My eyes stung. "Sweetheart," I said, steady as I could manage. "Of course you can. Anytime you want." Her breath hitched with relief, her voice small but full of hope. "Thank you, Grandma. I can't wait." When the call ended, I sat on the porch, the ocean's voice rising and falling in the darkness. Stars winked alive overhead, the night vast and full of promise. For months, my life had been consumed by endings of savings, of illusions of patience. But Ella's call was something new, something tender, a seed of beginning. I closed my eyes, breathing in the salt air, the sound of the sea steady like a heartbeat. For the first time in years, I felt not only free, but also needed, not as a source of money, but as a source of love. And that, I realized, was all I had ever wanted. Snow drifted down in soft sheets the morning I woke to prepare for my first Christmas at Sea Pines. The world outside my window was hushed and white, the ocean a dark stretch behind the dunes, its waves rising and falling like a heartbeat. I carried a small pine tree into the living room and set it near the window. It was hardly taller than me, but it fit the room perfectly. I wrapped it in warm white lights, hung the ornaments Robert and I had collected over the years, each one a memory, and placed a simple star at the top. When I stepped back, the cottage glowed with quiet joy. By afternoon, Ella and Jack arrived, their cheeks rosy from the cold, their arms filled with gifts they had wrapped themselves in paper that wrinkled at the corners and bows that slipped free. Grandma Ella said, her eyes shining, "These are for you." Jack lifted his, proudly holding the box out with both hands. I gathered them into my arms, pressing my cheek to their soft hair. For the first time in years, the joy of the season felt real. We spent the evening in the kitchen rolling dough and cutting shapes with cookie cutters Harriet had lent me. Flour dusted our clothes and the counters, Jack sneaking bits of dough when he thought I wasn't looking. Ella sprinkled sugar on top with careful concentration, laughing when her brother dumped half a jar on one star. We slid the trays into the oven, the cottage filling with the smell of butter and cinnamon. When we tasted the first batch still warm, we laughed at the uneven shapes and the ones that broke, eating them quickly before they cooled. Later, the three of us strung paper snowflakes Ella had made at school across the little tree. Jack insisted on putting one at the very top, stretching on his tiptoes while I steadied him. The tree looked simple, imperfect, but it was ours. It was beautiful. The phone rang as we finished, Daniel's name glowing on the screen. I hesitated before answering, but when I did, his voice was different. It was quieter, stripped of the pride that once coated every word. Mom, I wanted you to know I accepted a job. Hamilton Pierce offered me a position, steady pay health insurance. It isn't mine, not like the firm was, but it's real. I can provide for them now on my own. There was a pause, then his words broke slightly. I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. For the years I let you carry what I should have carried. I should have stood up to Sam. I should have seen what I was doing to you. In the background, I heard the faint rustle of movement, Sam's voice low and clipped, but she didn't speak into the phone. Her silence was louder than any protest. I listened, my throat tight, my heart aching but steady. I told him simply, I hear you, and I am glad you are standing on your own now. Then I added, my voice firm, I love you, Daniel, but I will never fund your lives again. This Christmas, I choose peace. He breathed out slowly as if the words had been what he both dreaded and needed to hear. Thank you, Mom, he whispered before the line clicked off. I returned to the children who had been pretending not to listen and pulled them into a hug. Their eyes shone with the reflection of the tree's glow, and I felt the truth of it. This was all that mattered. We ate a simple dinner together, soup and bread warm from the oven, before bundling in blankets on the porch. The snow fell steady, covering the sand, the ocean waves breaking beyond the dunes. Ella leaned against me. Jack curled at my side, both of them warm and safe. I looked out at the wide horizon, stars scattering across the night sky, and let the weight of the past years finally settle. They had wanted Christmas without me. Now they had it stripped of illusion, stripped of grandeur. And I had found something far greater, a home of my own, a peace that could not be bought, and the love of two children who saw me not as a bank, but as their grandmother. I whispered into the cold night, my words carried by the sea breeze. They wanted Christmas without me. I gave them Christmas without a home. The children did not stir, but perhaps they felt it in the way I held them closer, in the way my shoulders finally loosened. The circle was closed. What had begun with sacrifice and silence ended here with truth and peace. As I sat with Ella and Jack against the sound of the sea, I knew this Christmas would be remembered not for what was lost, but for what was finally found. If you've stayed with me through this story, I invite you to share what it made you feel. Have you ever been taken for granted until you finally said no more? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story touched you, stay with our channel for more. Your voices and your presence keep these stories alive.